Title: The last bus, double quotes. That night, Daniel had just finished working overtime. His body felt tired and his eyes were heavy. The clock showed 11 p.m. He looked at the bus schedule displayed at the bus stop. The last bus to his house would arrive in 10 minutes. The atmosphere of the night was getting more tense. There were only 1 or 2 people passing by, and the roar of vehicles was increasingly rare. Daniel decided to wait on the bus stop bench while occasionally checking his phone. Between the rows of towering buildings, the night wind slipped coldly into his body. Every now and then, he pulled his jacket closer, trying to ward off the increasingly piercing cold. Suddenly, Daniel felt something strange. The place suddenly felt quiet. He looked up from his phone and realized that there was no one passing by. The streets were so empty, even the sound of vehicles seemed to have disappeared. He started to feel uneasy. However, he immediately dismissed that feeling when he saw the bus he was waiting for approaching from a distance. The bus stopped in front of him with a soft squeal of brakes. The bus door opened slowly. The driver, an old man with a weary face and sunken eyes, looked at Daniel expressionlessly. "Get in," he said in a hoarse voice. Daniel nodded without thinking and got on the bus. The moment he entered, he immediately felt something was wrong. This bus looked old and worn, unlike the usual buses. The seats were covered in worn cloth, and some of them were torn. A musty and damp smell filled the air inside the bus. There were only a few passengers inside, all sitting quietly with their faces covered in shadows, as if they didn't care about his presence. Daniel sat in the back, right next to the window. Outside, the night was getting darker. The streetlights that were previously on now looked dim or even completely off. His heart beat faster, but he tried to calm himself down. "It's just a strange feeling, maybe because I'm tired," he muttered to himself. The bus moved along quietly, but as they went further, Daniel began to feel that the route was not as usual. The road they were on seemed unfamiliar, too quiet, and increasingly dark. He glanced at the other passengers, hoping to find someone to talk to. But the more he looked, the stranger they seemed. The faces, though vague, seemed too pale and completely motionless. Daniel felt increasingly uncomfortable. Finally, he dared to get up and walk over to the driver. "Sir, is this still the right route? It looks like we've deviated from the usual route," he asked in a trembling voice. The driver turned his head slowly, his eyes still blank and dark. "Don't worry, son. We'll get there. All the passengers here will get to their destinations," he replied with a strange smile that made the hair on Daniel's neck stand on end. Feeling increasingly uncomfortable, Daniel returned to his seat. However, as he was about to sit down, something strange caught his eye. On the seat next to him, there was a shabby bag that he remembered not being there when he first sat down. Slowly, he opened the bag, hoping to find a clue to its owner. The bag contained strange objects. A black and white photograph of a grim-looking woman, a blood-stained handkerchief, and a small notebook with what appeared to be chaotic handwriting. On one of the pages was a sentence that sent shivers down Daniel's spine. "This bus is not for the living. Double quotes. Daniel paused. His brain tried to process the sentence, but he couldn't ignore the chill that crept up his spine. Quickly, he closed the bag and threw it back on the seat. He wanted to get off. This didn't make sense. The bus suddenly stopped. The door opened, and a man got in. However, there was something very strange about the man. His face was as pale as a corpse, with dark circles under his eyes, as if he had not slept for a long time. The man walked slowly towards Daniel's seat. As the man passed each seat, Daniel noticed that the other passengers who had been quiet before began to change. The faces that were previously blurry were now clearly visible. They were not human. Their skin was pale blue. Their eyes were empty without the light of life. They all looked like corpses. Daniel choked with fear. He wanted to scream, but his voice seemed to be stuck in his throat. He shrank back, getting more and more cornered in his chair. The man kept coming closer, his eyes staring at Daniel with a blank but menacing stare. "Get off," the man's voice echoed in Daniel's ears. "You shouldn't be here." Gasping for breath, Daniel ran towards the still open door of the bus. Without thinking, he jumped out, tumbling onto the cold street. He staggered to his feet, his breath coming in short gasps. The bus behind him began to move slowly, its old engine sounding like a ghostly groan. When he turned around, he saw that the bus now looked different. It was no longer an ordinary old bus, but a bus filled with black shadows waving at him from the windows. Slowly, the bus faded, disappearing into the darkness of the night. Daniel stood there, frozen. The street around him was so quiet, only the wind howling softly. He tried to gather his wits to think about what had just happened. Soon, another bus arrived, more modern and bright. The driver looked normal, and the passengers were ordinary people. Daniel, trembling, got on the bus. He sat in the back seat, still out of breath. However, when he was about to lean his head back to calm himself, he heard a whisper in his ear. "You're safe this time. But remember, the last bus is always waiting." Daniel was stunned. The whisper sounded so real, as if it was spoken right next to his ear. He looked around, hoping it was just his imagination because of his previous fright. However, the bus this time seemed normal. There were no passengers who looked strange, and the driver did not show any signs of strangeness like he had experienced before. Even so, the feeling of unease still haunted him. The bus drove on the quiet road, bringing Daniel closer to his home. However, Daniel's mind was still in chaos, replaying the terrifying events that had just happened. He tried to find answers. How could all that happen? Was he just dreaming? Or was it real? After about 15 minutes of travel, the bus stopped at a bus stop near Daniel's house. With hurried steps, he got off and walked quickly towards his apartment at the end of the street. Every now and then he glanced back, making sure no one was following him. Every step he took sounded loud on the quiet street, further strengthening the feeling that something was still stalking him. Arriving at the apartment, Daniel immediately went in and closed the door hard, then locked it. He leaned against the door, trying to calm his irregular heartbeat. His apartment felt colder than usual. The light in the living room felt dim, making the shadows around him seem to move faintly. Digga decided to go to sleep immediately and forget everything that happened. In his room, he lay down on his bed, pulling the blanket up to cover his body. However, as he began to close his eyes, the whispering voice came again. This time it was closer, clearer. "You can't run." Daniel opened his eyes quickly. He looked left and right, making sure no one was in his room. His body began to tremble. He tried to convince himself that this was just the effect of excessive fear. However, the whisper kept repeating, "We are waiting for you." Unable to hold back his fear any longer, Digga jumped out of bed and ran out of his room. He stumbled towards the living room, turning on all the lights. The bright light calmed him down a bit, but the whisper still haunted him. As time went on, the voices grew louder, as if coming from inside his head. Daniel sat on the sofa, holding his heavy head. He tried to distract himself by opening his phone, hoping to find something that would make him feel better. When he opened his phone, a new message came in. An unknown number sent a short message. "You forgot something on the bus." Daniel's heart skipped a beat. The message seemed to hammer his fear deeper. He knew he couldn't have left anything on the bus. Furthermore, he was certain the number couldn't have come from anyone he knew. With shaking hands, he typed a reply. "Who is this?" A short while later, the reply came in quick succession. "Us, the last passengers on the bus. You shouldn't have gotten off." Daniel immediately threw his phone to the floor, fear peaking. He clearly remembered the message in the shabby bag he found on the bus earlier. This bus is not for the living. In his panic, Daniel decided to get out of his apartment. He thought maybe if he got away from this place, all the strangeness would stop. Without thinking, he ran out into the street. The previously quiet street now felt even gloomier. The streetlights seemed to flicker, and a thin fog began to descend, obscuring his vision. Daniel kept running, not knowing where he was going. His heart was pounding, cold sweat was pouring down his body. But wherever he went, the whispering voice followed him, getting louder, clearer. "You should have come with us. This is not your time to live." Suddenly, Daniel realized that he was at the same bus stop where he had waited for the last bus before. His breath was ragged, his head was spinning, and his body was about to collapse from exhaustion. He looked around, hoping for someone else, anyone who could help him. But the street was empty, just him alone in the darkness. Soon, he heard a very familiar sound. The sound of an old bus engine approaching from a distance. Daniel turned his head, and there, the last bus came again, slowly stopping in front of him. The bus door opened, and inside, Daniel could see the same passengers as before, with pale faces and empty eyes. In the front seat, the old driver looked at him with a cold smile. "You know where you're going, right?" The driver's voice sounded more sinister than before. Daniel backed away slowly, trying to get away, but his body couldn't move any further, as if something was holding him in place. The whispers from inside the bus grew louder. "Come back, come back. You belong here with us." The bus seemed to get darker, as if sucking all the light around it. The black shadows that covered the bus windows seemed to be waving at Daniel, as if calling him in. Daniel couldn't take it anymore. In his panic, he ran away with all his might. He ran without looking back, hoping to escape the bus pursuit. But the sound of the bus engine got closer, chasing him like a predator ready to pounce on its prey. The road he was on seemed to have changed. It was no longer an ordinary city road, but a road surrounded by thick fog and towering trees. The night atmosphere became increasingly tense. Daniel's steps became slower, his body began to tire. Finally, Daniel arrived at a dark intersection with no way out. He turned around and saw the old bus stop at the end of the road. The bus door opened again, and from inside, the passengers began to get off one by one. They walked toward Daniel, their bodies moving slowly but surely. Their eyes were blank, their faces emotionless. Daniel backed up until his back hit the stone wall behind him. There was nowhere to run. The shadows of the bus passengers now surrounded him, getting closer. The old bus driver walked closer, his sneer growing more pronounced. "It's time you came with us," he said in an echoing voice. With the last of his strength, Daniel tried to fight back, tried to scream, but his voice was drowned out by the whispers that grew louder in his ears. Slowly, the dark shadow swallowed him, and the world around him turned into complete darkness. The next morning, at the bus stop where Daniel was waiting for the bus, people began to gather as usual. No one realized that the night before, someone had disappeared into the darkness. The buses that came and went continued to serve their passengers, as if nothing strange had ever happened. However, among the usual passengers, there was a new figure. A man with a pale face, sitting silently in the back seat of the bus, staring blankly out the window. His face showed no emotion, his eyes were empty, as if he was just a shadow of someone who once existed. The last bus always waited, and now, Daniel was one of those who never came home.